What we're going to look at now is how to deal with custom function call macros. Let's look first in the UI. So the idea is we can create a macro and provide function call here. And that basically says we provide a function name here, ABC, and it will call into your application and try and find any handler that's registered to deal with the function name ABC. Call that and then use the return result against which you can then write rules. What sorts of functions might you use? Well, one possibility would be SDK calls for which we don't provide predefined macros. For instance, we do provide a predefined macro for the device name or app version or language or OS version, right? Those are all provided. What if we wanted something like, let's say, the current volume? We don't provide such a thing, so you can write your own custom macro. The other thing you might want to write macro for is information that's specific to your application. For instance, what's the preference that they have for a particular preference setting? Or how many times have they run their application? Or how many things have they purchased over their lifetime? Stuff like that that you might want to have a macro so that you can write rules for. In our case, we're going to go ahead and use the volume. So this function name is going to get actually passed. You're going to register a handler that'll handle this function name. You can provide arguments if you want that get passed in to the handler. In our case, we're not going to need any. So we're going to have volume. In this case, there are different kinds of volumes. On Android, we're going to go ahead and use the music volume. This macro name is used only in the UI for writing your rules. This is going to be used in your app as well. So we'll go ahead and save that. And now we've got this macro defined. We'll come back later and actually write some rules against that. So how do we actually handle it? Well, what we need to do is once we've got the container, in this case in our container available, we want to register a function called macro handler. What's the name we want to use? The same exact name that we used here, this function name. And we need a custom macro handler. Well, let's just write one. So it's going to be a, let's say, volume macro handler. Okay. And we'll go ahead and let Eclipse create a class for us. It knows that the interface is container function called macro handler. And we've got this method. So get value is what's going to get returned whenever this macro gets evaluated. It gets passed in the function name. And the reason it gets passed into the function name is it's possible you could register multiple, a single handler to handle multiple different functions. And you could just differentiate based on the function name how it got called. And here we have our unused parameters we're not using. Okay. On Android, in order to get the volume, we need to use an audio manager. So we're going to use audio manager.getStreamVolume, and we pass in an audio manager stream music. Okay. Now we haven't defined our audio manager yet, but let's go ahead and make this a field, and then we'll initialize it in a constructor. And what we'll do is go ahead and take in a context and initialize it from that. So what happens is we can get an audio manager by calling context.getSystemService. And we pass in the audio service. Okay. And let's see what we're complaining about. We actually need to return this value. So this is good, except we have an error, I believe, because here we need to actually pass in the context. So let's pass in a context. We don't want to pass in this, because this is actually our notifier. We want to pass in the splash screen activity this for our enclosing class. And what's the complaint is we're missing a semicolon. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and run this. Meanwhile, let's come back over to the container tag UI and write some rules against this music volume. So what we have is a value collection, which is fuzzy. So this is not the best example, but what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have our animals be fuzzy animals if the volume is not muted. And otherwise, we're going to call them quiet animals. So we want the fuzzy to be true always, except in the case where we're muted. So let's create a rule called muted. When are we muted? We're muted if the music volume is equal to 0, right? So we're going to be fuzzy if we're not muted. And then we need to create a new macro, which is a value collection. And this we'll call, let's say, a quiet adjective. And here, what we're looking for is adjective, and we're going to call it quiet. And when is this true? This is true exactly in the case where we're muted. Let's go ahead and create a version and publish this. And if we come back now to our application, we can see our application says quiet. Now keep in mind, it already got the container. We're going to need to go ahead and refresh it because we just published it. And it still says quiet. Sorry, it says quiet. Why does it say quiet? Let's take a look. It says quiet because the volume is muted. If we increase the volume, and then come back to our application, we see actually no change. And the reason for that is our application hasn't reevaluated and re-gotten the adjective. But if we go in here, it retrieves it in this category. And if we come back, unfortunately the top level doesn't retrieve it. The only time it retrieves the adjective is if we do a refresh again. So that refresh was sort of a no-op. It went to the server, found out there was no change to container, came back. But as a side effect, what our application does is also reread the adjective. So we can see what we're getting basically is fuzzy if it's not muted and quiet if it is muted. And that's all using a custom function call macro.